Video. There we are. Hi. Thank you, Kaziz. I'm Elaine Silverstein. I am VP for chapters of the Native Plant Society of New Jersey, and I have been enjoying this morning's presentations very, very much, as I hope you all have. It is my pleasure to introduce Ian Caton, who's going to talk about my very favorite part of the forest, the understory. I'm always a person who looks down when I'm walking. Ian has been the owner-operator of Wood Thrush Native Plant Nursery in Virginia since 2013. Wood Thrush Native Plants specializes in the native plants of the Appalachian region, and it focuses on introducing new and rare plants which are little known or underappreciated in the nursery trade. Previously, Ian worked with Larry Weiner Landscape Associates, and I believe that Larry Weiner is a guru to most of us. This is the renowned Pennsylvania-based firm specializing in the use and promotion of native plants and landscaping. He maintains an ongoing relationship with the firm and its educational arm, which is New Directions in Landscape, NDAL. So with no further ado, here is Ian to talk about Understory.
Thank you very much. Hopefully I'm coming through okay. Yeah, and I want to actually additionally thank Larry Weiner and NDAL because a lot of the photos I'll be using are projects that I was involved in on with Larry over the many decades that I've worked with him. And I've been a nurseryman for the last 10 years, mostly focused on growing plants. So I rely very much on Larry for my landscape information. And in fact, the first part of my lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about landscape and landscape technique. Many of these concepts that I've applied to general landscapes are also applicable to woodland landscapes. And then I'll get into kind of a rough introduction to some of the plant material with a focus on like about 10 to 20 really important plants that I think are worth concentrating on, since I can't really give you a full course on woodland plants. The first thing I want to talk about with landscaping and landscaping in a lot of woodlands and in general is that one of the things that we want to remember is that, a lot of the plants that we don't think about are kind of the canvas in these landscapes. They're the background. They're the important plants that knit everything together, but they're not always the first things we think about when we're doing our landscape work and our design work, which often has especially when we're dealing with clients, often has a more specifically ornamental orientation. They're more interested in color and flowers and things like that oftentimes. But you have to think about, especially in the woodland, what is there in the background? Often a lot of it is ferns and grasses and sedges. They make up a lot of the working part of the landscape, especially in woodlands. They're what is providing the stability. They're what's providing the actual ecological function in many cases. On top of this background canvas, you can then start layering in a lot of the other material that you would find in the woodlands and that you would want to incorporate into a landscape that is going to be, of interest to a particular client's needs. And just like in a lot of sunny meadows and sun-oriented landscaping, a big part of the focus in terms of how to plant and how to do it successfully, I'm going to talk about with matrix planting, that this is a way of mixing the plants together in a natural way that makes them work well together, makes them more resilient, and makes them deer resistant more so, than the traditional landscaping methods, which tend to be a little bit more like a buffet for deer, where everything is separated by 8 to 10 inches of mulch, making it really easy for deer and other animals to zoom in on the things that they're interested in. That's just not how they grow in the wild. So a couple of examples, this is just an example from a prairie or a made meadow, but this applies to the woodland too. And even more so, I have found that a lot of woodland perennials and actually perform better when you mix them in, particularly with a sedge, than if you were to plant them by themselves. So many plants like woodland phlox, like Salvia lyrata, the lyre leaf sage, creeping phlox. I have had them fail in landscapes when I've planted them alone. They've only succeeded when I planted them with other plants. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that as I go along here. So when you're talking about a matrix, you can be talking about it in a couple of different ways. You can talk about mixing plants together in space, tall plants and short plants. That's a really obvious example. In the case here, Amsonia tabernaemontana with Chrysogonum virginianum, the green and gold. But you can also talk about mixing them temporarily in time. Here's Mertensia virginica in a planting that will ultimately have a completely different collection of plants in it later on in the season. Effectively, you are covering multiple seasons with plants here, so that there's never much time when there's not something going on in the landscape. Again, you're increasing diversity, you're increasing biomass in this planting, which is all going to stabilize it, make it less weed prone, and you'll end up with a much more successful planting. Now, these obviously are gardens rather than woodlands, but they are shady, they are under trees. When you do mix these things in this way, you do have to know a lot about how your plants grow so that you can plant them in complementary patterns. If you were to mix things that are not really, they don't really work together, then you're going to fail. And here's an example. Aesthetically, here, the Marshallia grandiflora, barber's button, looks nice with the sundrop, Anothera fruticosa. But this is a plant that grows in rock crevices along rivers. And Anothera fruticosa, the sundrop, is a generalist plant that likes to grow in meadows and fields and is very aggressive. They're ornamentally complementary. They even grow about the same size, and you would think that they would work well together. But Marshallia is weak compared to the Anothera. They don't come from the same habitat. A rock crevice habitat versus an open field or open woodland habitat. So you've got to make sure that you're pairing your plants like to like, otherwise you're going to lose some of these things. A little bit of release of pure design is also important when you're putting these things together. Make sure you're not pairing them, even if they do come from the same kind of habitats, with a design in mind that's static. For example, this particular project here was designed with river oats, Casmantium latifolium, and big leaf aster, Aster macrophylla. Both of these plants could be complementary. They could grow in a riverside or riverine or alluvial woodland. But this particular design has them in two different separate areas. They're both pretty aggressive plants, but the Casmantium is being held in the background, while the big leaf aster is being held in the foreground. Now, if you know anything about these plants, you know that their tendency is going to be to mix together. The Casmantium is going to seed into the foreground. Well, you know how this particular designer got around that? They sprayed the front end of this design with grass-specific herbicide to maintain this two-tiered landscape. So the design of it ended up having herbicide included as part of the maintenance, which is just sort of crazy. It's you're taking something where it would work better if you were to allow these things to mix together naturally than to try to maintain a static design. Going along here, again, to know how to put a lot of plants together closely, you need to know how their root systems work together as well as how they grow on the top. Different depths of roots means that you can put shallow rooted things with deep rooted things, and you can put them right on top of one another and they won't compete with one another. Stoloniferous plants. Again, they're shallow rooted plants that tend to seek out openings and gaps in the landscape. A lot of the ground covers that we use are these kinds of plants. Mixing them with other things that are more solid and deep rooted means you can put a lot of plant material into an area. Some examples of stoloniferous plants like pussy toes, or the more aggressive American wild strawberry, Fragaria virginica. Really great evergreen ground cover, actually. Rhizomatous plants. Now, these are similar, except that the stems are underground. And the thing about a rhizomatous underground stem plant is that it's not reliant on photosynthesis to move into a new area the way a stoloniferous plant does. A stolon actually has to photosynthesize to survive. If it can't find a place where it can photosynthesize, that stolon will die. But a rhizome is getting all of its energy off the parent, and it's able to force itself into existing material. So these are the kind of plants that are really useful in existing woodlands, like in existing meadows, in existing woodland edges, and places that have other plants already growing, where you might want to increase diversity, or you're just trying to kind of fill out an area. These plants will actually spread and increase under the competition of other plant material, which also makes them very useful for weed suppression. If you have a very weedy area, and you're looking for plant-based solutions to solve that weed problem or increase the diversity in that weedy area without necessarily throwing a lot of herbicides around. So common milkweed, an example, or white turtlehead, another example. Deep-rooted plants, clump-forming deep-rooted plants. Now, from a design point of view, these are the plants that tend to stay put, spread very minimally, and so they become like your design anchors. They're the ones that are actually going to, from a distance, also be the most visible plants and ornamental to people who are casually visiting and entering a landscape. So this is where you can add a lot of material that is got visual interest. Of course, some of these examples are coming from more sun-based landscapes like broom sedge, or blue star, which is also a good shade plant. This also plays into budget. Size of material. I like or prefer to use smaller material, especially in a woodland. As someone mentioned earlier, you don't want to disturb the roots or damage the roots of too many plants. And I find small plants often survive better. They're cheaper. You're doing a lot less disturbance. The exception to that is your big rooted plants, your clumping, your more deep-rooted clumpers like Amsonia and Baptisia. They're slower to develop, and it is probably worth buying them slightly bigger. Everything else I prefer to buy in plug trays, because they're just like sort of the ground covering background that knits together and fills up everything in between everything else. Some thoughts on poor soils and drought, and this specifically comes to one of a particular pet peeve of mine, especially in woodlands, and that's the use and overuse of mulch and mulches. And this could be applied to shredded leaf mulch as well, although not as much, but sometimes. The heavy application of mulches oftentimes has a tendency to undo a lot of the work that you've done in a landscape. Here's an example. Remember, I'm telling you about all these sedges and all this background stuff and all these ground covers that are meant to knit together and fill this space in. They're really doing the work that mulch is doing. They're the ones that are moderating soil temperature, that are going to be the weed suppressors. But you go and dump a pile of mulch on top of them, and they're going to really retreat from their ability to spread. They can't move and increase as readily. Here's an example where on the left-hand side, some of those sedges have started to knit together, but someone's been dumping and dumping and dumping mulch here every year. And it's really restraining the ability of an actual ground cover matrix to form. And I can't tell you how many landscapes I've created where we actually successfully established a really nice, good ground cover, only to come back a year or two later to find that it's just a pile of mulch. Most plants react very badly to almost any kind of mulch being put on top of them, other than for establishment purposes, which is the only time I ever use it, just during the initial planting stages, and then natural leaf fall onto the site. And that should be all that's ever done. I almost never recommend any kind of cultivating of these soils, even very heavily disturbed soils. I'd almost never recommend any kind of organic material addition, not only because a lot of the organic materials that are added increase your risk of bringing in serious detrimental weed species, not to mention jumping worms and other invasive species that are often hidden within composts and mulch. But in many, and the addition of irrigation also, I can't tell you again how many times I've run across defunct irrigation systems that the homeowner didn't even realize were there. Oftentimes these things are unnecessary and they just become garbage in the future. These things aren't necessary. Here is a construction site in the Catskills. And this is just construction soil that's been spread back out onto the ground. Because this is in the mountains, this particular building or home is built right onto the bedrock. And that bedrock is only about 6 to 8 inches under this soil. So whenever it rains, it actually puddles a little bit here. There's actually an ephemeral pool that forms here. We added no irrigation to this. We added no organic to this other than what was existing in the soil to begin with. And all we did was add a lot of plant material in here, including sedges. You can see Pennsylvania sedge in the bottom left-hand corner, which is actually mixed throughout this entire planting, mixed in with the Iris cristata, mixed in with the Phlox stolonifera. And it really, after a while, completely filled in this area and stabilized it. And it's not detrimental at all to the health and growth of any of the other perennials there. No mulch was ever added to this beyond the initial planting. And it has worked out. Even this is probably planted 15, 20 years ago now, and it's still a very beautiful landscape now. I mentioned before about how a lot of stoloniferous plants can compete in aggressive situations. And here's just an example I want to put out there. Here is a shady area. It's invaded with Japanese stiltgrass. And here we've planted 4 pink turtlehead. Now that's a southern species, but it is a more shade tolerant turtlehead, and it's fairly attractive. And doesn't require as much sun or moisture as the white turtlehead. It is rhizomatous, so it will increase. It forms a very dense cover. And those 4 pink turtlehead, with no additional help, completely dominated the site and eliminated the Japanese stiltgrass. Now, I say eliminated, that's probably only a visual elimination. There might still be Japanese stiltgrass in there, but it has largely been rendered moot in a way. It is now dominated by a native cover that has a greater biological and natural importance than certainly Japanese stiltgrass did. This can be done in many different situations in many different ways. This creek bank was also dominated with stiltgrass and garlic mustard when we started there. And a combination of golden Alexanders and Pecora aurea. Oh boy, I've lost the name of that plant. Pecora aurea, the golden groundsel. Those two plants alone, with a little bit of effort, of coming in and removing the garlic mustard during the winter time when garlic mustard is evergreen and it can be easily removed. We were able to switch this from a garlic mustard dominated site to a golden Alexander dominated site within a year or two. And because it is now so thoroughly dominated by these two plants, it is very hard for a plant like garlic mustard, Japanese stiltgrass to get reestablished in there. And if they do come in, it is very easy to see it and to get in there and remove it quickly before it gets going. And this also can be a real help when it comes to damaged and degraded soils from worms. Many people are becoming more and more aware of the damage that worms can do in woodlands in particular, not just jumping worms, even traditional old-fashioned night crawlers, where their activity totally destroys and degrades the soil, turning it into worm poop, in which a lot of native plants have a hard time growing and establishing. This is a site in Yonkers, New York, that was totally degraded, completely 100% worm castings. And we had a hard time getting anything to survive in there. But we did work out some plants, and we kind of repeated this a little bit at another site in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, where certain plants, if you get them established, they act as a zone of stability. And then around those plants, other plants are able to colonize. And so rather than trying to plant the entire site, we mulched it with leaf material and wood chips to bring some organic back into the site because the worms had eaten it all. Planted certain plants that seemed to grow really well in those worm castings. And then over time, those plants were able to expand and colonize the site. Here it is at the top of a hill. That's all worm castings. And within a few years, the entire site self-colonized and repaired itself. And once those plants got established, a lot of other plants began to show up in there as well. So the ability of plants to repair a disturbed and damaged site, severely damaged, I think can't be entirely underestimated. All right, let's talk about seeds a little bit, because another thing that people sometimes ask me about is you can, a lot of meadows, there's a lot of information about out there in wildflower seed for creating big acres of meadows and wildflower and prairie. But why is it so much harder to do that in the woods? Why is it hard to get woodland seed, for one thing? Woodland seed is also so expensive. It becomes very difficult to get enough seed to actually do any work in a woodland. So there's a couple of things to realize or to know about woodland plants, a lot of woodland plants versus a lot of prairie plants. In a woodland, seeds tend to ripen in two time zones. A lot of spring blooming things, and a lot of the things that grow in our woods are spring blooming. Those seeds tend to ripen in midsummer or late spring. Those seeds ripen very irregularly, and the seeds, as soon as they ripe, don't tend to stay on the plant. They tend to drop off immediately. Thirdly, those seeds have to be sown immediately. If you hold on to them, they will lose viability, or else they'll go into a deeper dormancy. Woodland plants whose seed develop in the autumn and ripen in the autumn tend to behave a lot more like a traditional prairie plant. You can collect them in the autumn, and you can store them and sow them for in the wintertime, and they'll germinate just like a wildflower meadow seed. So it's really a lot of these more spring blooming things that tend to be like that. Woodland plants tend to produce a lot less seed. Collecting that seed is difficult because, like I said before, the seed tends to ripen irregularly. So you have to check on those plants every day. And oftentimes you might go out there and be collecting those seeds 2 or 3 at a time every day over a period of weeks. It's very labor intense. The seeds tend to be very small, and it's very hard to collect a lot of seed from one plant. And like I said, you generally have to sow that seed immediately. It will lose viability. So if you buy woodland seed from a seed house that's been storing it for a year or a season, it will probably have you'll probably have less success from that seed than if you collect that seed yourself and sow it immediately. A lot of them have to be sown in the summertime. Just for a couple of quick examples, Spigella marilandica. Those seed pods, you can see there's 2 of them in the upper left-hand corner. You can see there's an exploded one down here in the lower right. Those seed pods ripen 2 at a time, and they burst 2 at a time. So unless you go out there and collect them as they ripen, you're going to lose them. And even if you do collect them immediately, you're probably only going to get about 6 to 10 seeds. So it's impossible to collect huge amounts of this plant. And that's just an example that is repeated across a lot of woodland plants. Here's another example. This is snakeroot, Aristolochia serpentaria. Those pods, in my experience, they're there one day, and the next day they're completely gone, utterly gone. I don't know if mice are stealing them in the night, but it's one of those cases where they're not ripe, they're not ripe, they're not ripe, and then they're gone. And again, this all just is one of the reasons why it's so much more expensive to get seed that's woodland oriented. And it's a lot better if you can establish these things on your project and collect from there or allow them to self-colonize. So some examples of plants that have spring or summer ripening seed, a lot of familiar favorites like Camassia, wild geranium, and bluebells. Again, those plants, you have to collect them and sow them in the summertime. If you hold on to those seeds, they'll lose viability. They have to have a summertime stratification. Jacob's ladder, another example. All the phloxes, virtually all phlox, if you collect phlox seed, has to be sown immediately to be successful with it. Antonaria and Pachyra, these are plants that have wind-blown seeds, and they actually don't have any cold stratification requirements. If you hold on to the seeds dry and sow them in the autumn for winter stratification, they generally will not come up in the spring. You have to sow them in the summertime, but unlike phlox and Jacob's ladder, which will still have to go through both the summer and the winter before they germinate, Pachyra will germinate in the autumn. Same with Antonaria. A lot of spring blooming, wind-blown plants will actually germinate in the summer and autumn. They just don't have any dormancy requirements. Same with Chrysogonum virginianum, green and gold. If you collect that seed in the summertime and sow it immediately, it will germinate within 2 or 3 weeks. If you hold on to that seed and sow it for winter stratification, generally it will not succeed. Bloodroot, another example. All the trilliums, virtually every spring ephemeral has to be collected and sown immediately. Autumn ripening seeds. It doesn't matter if they're spring blooming. Well, Eurybia, white wood aster, or Actaea racemosa, for example. All of the woodland edge type monardas, penstemons, which is a spring blooming plant, but a lot of spring blooming plants, they don't necessarily ripen their seeds in the summertime the way like phloxes and trilliums do. Some of these spring blooming plants will ripen their seed in the autumn, in which case you can treat those seeds exactly the same way you would in a prairie or a meadow, with winter stratification leading to a spring germination. So in a way, actually, a lot of things like the Penstemon hirsutus Not only that, they produce a lot of seed, and that makes them pretty valuable from a seed purchasing point of view, because it's actually a plant that's successful. Um, Same with Scutellaria incana and heuchera, very successful, very easy plants to sow seed of. And zizia. I think zizia is one of the most useful plants there is for restoring a lot of woodland ground level or ground layer and understory. It's such an adaptable plant. Self-pollination is really easy, but the seeds, even though this is a very early spring blooming plant, the seeds ripen in August and September. They're easy to collect, lots of them. They sow really readily, and they're successful in terms of their germination. And they grow across a wide range of habitats, not just sun, but also shade. Fruit-bearing seeds that are in fruit-bearing structures, like Polygonum commutatum, which produces these fruits. Another mistake a lot of people will have is they'll collect fruit, extract the seed, and then store that seed dry. Anytime you get seed out of a fruit or any kind of moist seed packet, you have to keep it wet. Don't let them dry out. If they dry out, they will lose viability, or else they will go into a deeper dormancy. So instead of taking 1 year to germinate, they might take 5, or they might germinate irregularly anytime over 10 years. So if you extract fruit from trillium, if you extract fruit from Solomon's seal or Solomon's plume, or any of a number of other fruit-bearing woodland plants, you can store that seed, but you have to store it damp. Oftentimes, if I'm storing this seed, I'm storing it in wet sand and just keeping it in my refrigerator until I'm ready to put it out in the landscape. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the plants themselves. And again, I'm going to talk about two general kinds of broad woodland situations: dry, rocky or dry upland woods, and richer, more cove or lowland woods. These are just sort of broad categories to talk about. It's very hard to put a lot of plants into categories, and it's funny what I found growing in some of these places over the years. But broadly speaking, these are two categories that are easy to talk about. Dry shade is one that actually gets overlooked, because I feel like a lot of woodland gardens and a lot of woodland landscape work that we do, the plants that are used are actually coming from the more lowland and cove oriented flowers. A lot of cove and rich woodland flowers are a lot showier and a lot better known. Dry and drier upland woods tend to be dominated by two broad groups of plants, or three, let's just say. They tend to be sedge dominated, sedge or grass dominated, with a collection of asters and goldenrods and legumes. Generally, you're not finding your flashy phloxes up in these dry, shady areas, or bluebells or things like that, or even trilliums often. Dry shade tends to have a whole different collection of plants. Pussy toes are a great example. Pussy toes and bluets, Hediotis cerulea, very common in these sort of dry, flinty upland situations. Columbine, Aquilegia canadensis, a popular plant frequently planted in soil that is much too rich for it. Here's its growing in its preferred natural location in moss on top of a boulder. I mean, these are plants that grow in drier, rockier upland woods. Sedges. Now, of course, there's like 2,000 species of sedge. I can't talk about all of them. All I can say is that sedge should never be ignored in any landscape. It is one of the most important plants in ecology. And broadly speaking, in woodlands, there are two kinds of sedges you can go with. These sort of grassy, more colonizing sedges epitomized by Carex pennsylvanica, the Pennsylvania sedge, which is still one of the most useful sedges out there in woodland landscape plantings. There are a whole lot of other ones, and of course, Mount Cuba did their big sedge study, of which I think Carex woodii came out on top in terms of landscaping. Interestingly enough, I believe Carex woodii until very recently was classified as a kind of Carex pennsylvanica. Carex pennsylvanica kind of got broken up into like a dozen different species, and I think woodii is one of them. So they are very, very similar in a lot of ways. The other kind of sedge, broadly speaking, are the broader leafed type sedges. Most of these broadleaf sedges are non-colonizing. They tend to be clumpy, but they lend themselves to a different kind of visual impact. And sometimes you're looking for something that isn't going to be quite as colonizing. You might want some other, for whatever reason, you might have some other aesthetic reasons for using something like seersucker sedge. Green and gold, Chrysogonum virginianum. Now, this is another plant that's recently been broken up, and I'm not going to go into all the details on this, but green and gold, which is one species, is now 3. And the only one that tends to grow in the Northeast is the clumping type that grows tall. The low-growing colonizing one comes more from the Carolinas. It's still a plant that is very useful in a lot of ways. In the wild, they tend to grow in these rocky, flinty upland woods, usually over limestone, although not necessarily all the time. Coreopsis. There are a lot of Coreopsis species that actually are fairly shade tolerant, and they grow in these dry upland woods. Coreopsis major, another one is Coreopsis pubescens, growing both in full sun, but also in fairly heavy shade. Poverty oats, like sedges, a lot of the grasses that grow in these dry upland woods are very useful plants and should be considered. It's very hard to buy poverty oats right now, I think, in the landscape trade, which is a shame. I think sedges, especially Pennsylvania sedge and other sedges like that, are getting a lot of the attention right now for doing this kind of work, the stabilizing canvas type work I was talking about. But there are a lot of grasses that could do the same work. And Danthonius spicata poverty oats is one of the best. Eurybia divaricata, common old white wood aster, very adaptable plant. I said that sedges and asters and goldenrods in particular are groups of plants that tend to dominate these drier woodlands. The other great thing about white wood aster is that it really works very well with ferns. It actually is able to resist a lot of the allelopathic chemicals that ferns put out. So one of the advantages to using ferns as your canvas, as opposed to, say, sedges, is actually the allelopathy of those ferns can be very useful in weedy woods, where you might be trying to control or maintain or restrict the growth of certain weeds. But a lot of these upland goldenrods and asters in particular are immune to that kind of allelopathy, and they grow quite well with them. Geranium maculatum, this is actually a good all-purpose plant. It grows almost anywhere, sun, shade, wet, dry. I've seen it in every conceivable situation. But it is a good flashy plant for an upland meadow. Or I mean, sorry, upland woodland. Geomphragoroides, barren strawberry, another one of those forgotten plants, I feel like. This is a great evergreen ground cover for a dry woodland. It's also fairly adaptable, but in the wild, I've only ever seen this plant in dry, rocky woods. Now, I will tell you that the real thing, the actual Geomphragoroides, is almost impossible to buy in the nursery trade. There is a non-native geum that goes under the name Geomphragoroides that is basically the plant that's being sold as Geomphragoroides everywhere. Unfortunately, even some fairly reputable nurseries. And the reason for that is it is very hard to tell the difference between the two. Um, but here I've shown you a picture of one of the easiest ways to tell the difference between the native and the non-native. The real native one is in the bigger picture, and you can see those petals are pointed, and each petal is individual with a gap between each petal. The flower in the upper left-hand corner, that is the non-native geum, and the petals are rounded and the petals overlap. So that is the main way to tell the difference between the two. And unfortunately, I don't know anyone who's selling the real GM fragilities. Maybe someone, this has been, it's been a while since I've been in, close contact with a lot of other big nurseries. So it could be that this isn't the case any longer, and maybe someone could tell me later whether or not there are some good nurseries with the real thing out there. But right now, it's very hard to get the real thing. So just beware of imposters with this plant. Sunflowers. There are a lot of native perennial sunflowers that are shade tolerant, especially this one. This is Helianthus divaricatus, growing in dry woodlands. Can grow in full sun too. It's a very adaptable plant. And, in my experience with most of the native sunflowers, the deer don't tend to bother them too much. And even if they do eat them, they're such aggressive, fast growers that they usually will come back and flower despite having been eaten. Heuchera americana, American alum tolerating some of the driest, darkest situations. Sometimes people ask me what will grow under a white pine or under a Norway maple. Some of the darkest, driest shade there is. And two of the plants I've seen under Norway maples and under white pines generally, American alum root and Christmas fern. Iris cristata, crested iris, a great ground cover. Now this one, sometimes people don't love because it's such a short bloom time, but those flowers pack a lot of punch. And I think it's a really great plant for a dry garden and for a dry woodland. Tend to grow in very ledgy soil. There's a lot of variation in this plant too. And this is actually another plant that I have heard from some botanists talking about breaking up into several separate species. If anyone's ever grown Iris Tennessee White, it's a very different looking plant in some ways, and I've heard that some people discuss that plant as being a separate species. Same with the Iris powder blue giant. It's such a bigger, bolder plant. Again, I have heard some talk that that might be a different plant, a different species. Monarda clinipodia, I showed a picture of this one earlier. This is a shade and drought tolerant Monarda. It is not very well represented in the nursery trade for reasons I can't quite figure out. One of the reasons might be that bee balms are so promiscuous in terms of their ability to hybridize with one another that any nursery that had this would very quickly find that they had hybrids instead of clinipodia, because you've got to keep this away from other monardas if you want to keep your clinipodia strains pure. But I will say, out in the wild, most bee balms are not pure. Bee balm hybridizes like mad out in the wild. And especially if you drive along the Blue Ridge Parkway, virtually every clinipodia population I've seen has had a certain amount of didyma or fistulosa mixed into it. So, I'm not particularly anti-hybrid in some cases, especially when it comes to a plant like this, the Monardas that just do it so frequently out in the wild. Penstemons, there are several different species of penstemon that are great shade plants. Penstemon hirsutus is one of my favorite ones. It's a very flashy plant, grows in extremely dry, rocky soil, can tolerate sun, it can tolerate some shade, and there is a lot of variation in this plant in the wild. The flowers can be anything from white to very dark pink purple. The plants can be anywhere from 4 or 5 inches tall to a foot and a half tall. So an extremely variable plant out there. Primula media, shooting star, another extremely variable plant. This plant can be white flowered. It can be pink flowered. Sometimes the soil chemistry influences those colors. Sometimes it doesn't. Down here in Virginia, West Virginia, I only see white ones. Doesn't matter what kind of soil they're growing in, always white. And they tend to grow in limestone-rich rocky woodlands. If you go out into Ohio, they grow in the prairies. And if you go up into like Pennsylvania, they tend to not be white. They tend to be pink. So it's an extremely variable plant. Actually, the seed of this one is you can often get in fairly large quantities, and it's pretty reliable. Mountain mints. Along with shade-loving bee balm, there are a lot of shade-loving mountain mints. And Pycnanthemum incanum is one of the best and most useful ones out there. I think it's getting a little bit more attention in the nursery trade these days. You can get seed of this from a lot of seed houses now. It's very reliable. It grows in extremely dry woodlands, as well as in full sun. Again, you can be full sun or shade. The main thing with incanum is that it does like a dry and it does like a rocky soil. Scutellarian cana, hoary skullcap, I think also getting a lot more play in the nursery trade these days. A wonderful plant growing in dry, gravelly, part shade to full shade. That just an amazing late summer bloom. So if you're looking for something that blooms around the same time that the asters start blooming, but you're bored with asters and goldenrods, here we go. Hoary skullcap, great shade plant. Woodland stonecrop, Sedum ternatum, always a useful plant. Again, a plant that tends to do well in these sort of mossy, rocky woodlands, mixes really well with sedges, often doing better when you do mix it with sedge. Silene stellata, the starry catchfly, another one of these plants that will grow in sun or shade. Mainly just needs dry soil. The flowers are incredible. I think they look like white moths or something like that. They're pretty nice. And Silene virginica, fire pink. People love this plant. Oftentimes they're disappointed that it doesn't seem to live very long. Most of the time people are planting in soil that's too good for it. This is a plant, again, that grows in dry, stony, rocky woods, usually on very steep hillsides. It's also fire dependent. You know, fire pink probably has less to do with the color of the flower than the fact that it is a fire responsive plant. Goldenrods, I mentioned that along with asters, that goldenrods are really big in dry woodlands. A lot of species of goldenrod. In fact, there's a huge number of goldenrods that grow in dry woodlands. I'm only going to show two of the more common ones, just again, because I can't show every single one, but Solidago bicolor for white doesn't get a lot of attention in the nursery trade, unfortunately, but it's a beautiful white flowering goldenrod with blue-green foliage or gray-green foliage, growing in sun or shade. And this one, a little bit better known, the wreath goldenrod, Solidago cassia, kind of co-dominant with white wood aster in many cases. Fairly, a little bit more of a generalist plant, growing in both rich soil as well as dry soil. All right, rich shade. Now, here is where a lot of familiar, very flashy plants grow. Many plants that grow in these rich shade conditions get bigger and they can produce showier flowers earlier in the season because they're moist. The amount of organic and moisture that they can draw from is far greater than in the drier areas. So plants like Actea pachypoda, doll's eyes, and Actea racemosa, black cohosh, one of the tallest woodland plants. If you're looking for height in shade, there's not a lot of very tall shade plants that are perennials, but of course, black cohosh, that's one of the best ones and probably the tallest one that I can think of. A lot of other ferns that grow in the shade and grow in these richer woods. Adiantum pedatum, in particular, great landscape fern. Canada anemone, Anemone canadensis, a great ground cover. This is extremely aggressive. So it's a useful plant, again, in sort of weedy woodlands where you're looking for something that's going to take over and suppress other weedy plants that you're trying to eliminate. Looking for a replacement for that woodland bed straw that everyone seems to love. I think Canada anemone is a perfect replacement. Aralia racemosa, the spikenard. There are actually multiple shade-loving Aralias. All of them are incredible plants. This is probably the best known one. There's also a non-native one that's gotten a lot of attention in the nursery trade because of its yellow foliage, which I don't really get why people like yellow foliage. I don't understand the appeal of a plant that looks like it's dying, but there you go. But the native one looks almost identical to the non-native one. So I see no reason to use the non-native one. One of the great things about this plant, apart from the flowers, which are a nice sort of a white spray, and it produces these fruit, which is a fruit that's very useful for a lot of songbirds, is the ebony stem that it has, and this great pagoda-like structure that it produces in the landscape. Goat's beard, Aruncus dioicus. This is a dioecious plant, has separately male and female plants. This picture here actually shows a male. Male flowers tend to be showier a lot of the time because of all the stamens that they have. But it is important, especially in a wild situation, to have both. So, make sure you plant a good number of these to make sure that you've got a good reproducing population. It likes a rich soil. And the other thing about this plant is that there are actually disjunct populations of it. It grows in the Pacific Northwest as well as in the East. And I suspect there's probably a big genetic difference between those two plants. So if you are buying Aruncus dioicus, it's one of those plants where I suspect that provenance is really important. It's probably pretty important that you get Eastern ecotypes of this plant rather than getting Western ecotypes. Wild ginger, Asarum canadensis. This is another one of those plants that sometimes gets forgotten about because it doesn't have showy, flashy flowers, but it is a good landscape workhorse. It's a good, aggressive ground cover that provides that kind of canvas against which everything else can show itself. Other ferns, lady fern, this is a great landscape fern. One of the nice thing about lady fern is that it produces fresh fronds all the time so that old fronds can fall away. A lot of other ferns only produce fronds once in the springtime, and then those fronds age and get tattered with time. But lady fern continues to produce multiple fronds over the entire season, so it always looks fresh and good. Waterleaf. This is an undersung ground cover. Beautiful evergreen or semi-evergreen plant. This is what it looks like in the springtime. It's got these great mottle watermarked leaves. Now, when it starts to actually grow in the springtime, the fresh new growth does not have that marking, and the flowers are nothing really to look at. But it is one of those
Excuse me,
plants that,
Ian, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you, but we're kind of running out of time. So if you
boy, it goes
could
by
start to
fast.
wrap up, it's fascinating. I'm taking notes like crazy here, and there's lots of questions. So I'd like to be able to have a few minutes to get to the questions, if you
Okay.
don't mind. Yeah, sorry about that.
Well, should I wrap up the questions now, or should I kind of just quickly, do I have enough time to quickly go through a few more? Can I go to like 5:55? I mean, can I go to like
We're
12:15?
supposed to start the panel at 12:15, and that's just
Okay.
now.
All
So
right.
I'm really sorry about that. Um, So it's fantastic. Yeah, I think
Well,
I'd like to go to the questions so that we can, because we've
okay.
come, they're sort
Okay.
of, there, a lot of them are quite similar. A
Well, I'll
couple of
tell you
people,
just real quick,
yes,
the dry upland plants, they're the ones that I think get shorter shrift anyway. A lot of these rich plants, cove plants, are familiar. The bluebells, the Jacob's ladder, the
yeah.
trilliums, the whatever. People
Mhm.
know them a lot better.
Yeah, I have
So
dry
anyway,
sandy soil and I can't grow most of those. So I've looked into the shade plants and they're fantastic. You can have a beautiful garden
yeah.
with the plants that are adapted to the dry rocky soil. So yeah, so I really appreciate, I wrote down a lot of things that I never thought I could grow. So now now I can try them. But a couple of people would like to know if there is a reference, a book or any other reference on native seed sowing techniques. In other words, you were grouping them, but is there any place where people can go and find out like how you sow, whatever particular plant?
Yeah, there are some good books. But apart from the books, I will say that actually Prairie Moon and Prairie Nursery, their seed germination information is pretty good. Now, their seed sowing information is often oriented towards a buyer who might be buying that seed any time of the year. So that's just one thing to caveat. They're not necessarily going to tell you that if you buy bluebell seed that you should sow it in the summertime, especially if it's good fresh
Mhm.
seed. But generally speaking, just as a rule of thumb, if whenever the seed ripens, whenever that happens to be, if the seed is ripening in June, if the seed is ripening in August or September or October, you should sow it or stratify it within weeks or at least a month of collecting. Any longer and whatever it needs is not going to be met.
Mhm. Okay, great. Thank you. You mentioned that there are plants that survive growing in worm castings, the plants that create zones of stability in that area.
Yeah.
Can you name a few of those plants? You showed a few pictures, but if you could
Yeah,
just name a few of
aggressive.
those
I mean,
plants.
basically not weak and often not rhizomatous plant. Not, I'm sorry, not rhizom, stoloniferous. So
Mhm.
I have found that stoloniferous plants like Phlox stolonifera and even Fragaria virginica, they can't establish their stolons in those worm castings. But clumping deep-rooted plants like the
Mhm.
Stylophorum, like Zizia, like a lot of clumping sedges,
Mm.
they seem to do really well. And rhizomatous plants, things that have strong underground root systems, do well also, like mayapple, for instance, just for
Mm.
a good shade example. So getting those things established seems to stabilize that region where they are, and then seeds and other plants get established around them. And
Mhm.
these clumps just tend to grow and grow and grow over time until the clumps grow together.
That's a fascinating solution because so many people are having problems with
And I
jungle
will
worms.
say
Yeah.
that those sites never became worm problems again, at least to my
Mm.
knowledge. After 20 years, it was
Wow.
a massive growth in worms. The population crashed. We repaired the site, and it doesn't seem to have gotten back to the way it was.
Okay. We got a number, this is gonna be my last question, but I'm putting some stuff together, but we got a lot of questions about are there specific plants that can outcompete lesser celandine, knotweed, and stiltgrass, particularly in a wet site? So looking for more of those really aggressive natives that might be able to
All right.
outcompete these plants.
Lesser celandine? No, you can't do it.
Yeah, I've tried.
Knotweed?
I
No.
tried Canada anemone. That didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, that site that I showed in Yonkers, the damaged site, actually did have knotweed in it. And we were able to get it to outcompete over time with river oats, but
Oh.
it wasn't a pure out competition. We actually went in and repeatedly cut back the
Mhm.
knotweed,
Mhm.
and it took several years for the knotweed to reduce and the river oats to grow, and then eventually we dug the remaining knotweed out.
But that's
So
fantastic.
knotweed you can sort of do. with stilt grass, the main thing you want with stilt grass is a lot of dense rhizomatous growth early in the season. Most cool season grasses like river oats and Elymus species
Mhm.
do pretty well. The pink turtleheads seem to do pretty well. I can't speak to too many others, but mainly you want a plant that's up quickly in the spring and very dense.
Well, I wonder if Packer or Oreo would do it.
I think it's too short. I think it will help.
Ah, okay, because it's evergreen.
Pacra
I'm in northern
aurea,
New Jersey and it's evergreen. Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it will help, and it really makes the stilt grass stand out. But I don't think I would rely on Pacra aurea alone to do it. I think Zizia aurea might actually work better.
Hmm. Okay, well, thank you very much. This was a fascinating talk. I was making notes like crazy for myself and my own horticulture practice. And thank you.
Well, I'm just sorry we couldn't get through the
Very,
whole
very,
thing. But
no,
if
no,
you do
no.
want to direct,
I wish you could have finished.
well,
It was
people can direct their
sorry to
questions to my
stop you.
website.
Okay,
I was gonna say
great. Thank
you can
you.
direct questions to my email. So I'll be happy to answer
Terrific.
them.
Okay, thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. And now